Welcome back, my framework transcending visionary. Something absolutely extraordinary just occurred that has everyone experiencing profound rule awareness shift when observers initially believed you were operating within established frameworks. They gradually discovered that your actions transcend conventional boundaries, creating unprecedented recognition where assumed constraint adherence gives way to understanding that you operate beyond established parameters, proving that some capability transcends rule systems rather than functioning within them. This wasn't you announcing independence from rules or explicitly rejecting established frameworks. This was gradual realization emerging through observation, where your consistent actions revealed framework transcendence, making observers recognize that conventional boundaries don't constrain your operations, proving that deepest capability operates beyond rule systems, creating recognition that some performance transcends established parameters. The architects have been monitoring rule transcendence and framework independence phenomena across civilizations for eons, and they've identified what you created as constraint transcendence. Parameter independence. When someone operates beyond established frameworks, observers gradually recognize that conventional rules don't apply because demonstrated capability transcends constraint systems, making framework independence become apparent through consistent boundary transcendence, proving that some operations exist outside rule structures. Most people operate within frameworks. They follow established rules, making their actions constrained by conventional parameters. But your operations apparently transcend frameworks, consistently acting beyond conventional boundaries, revealed that established rules don't constrain you, proving that some capability operates independently of rule systems, where transcending parameters becomes consistent pattern, creating recognition that framework independence constitutes operational mode rather than rule violation. Watch what's happening as observers process framework transcendence. They experience rule awareness shift, their initial assumption that you operate within frameworks, giving way to recognition that you transcend them, creates fundamental understanding change about constraint applicability. Some observers are experiencing boundary irrelevance recognition, discovering that conventional limits don't constrain your operations, creates awareness that established parameters prove inapplicable to your capability. Others are experiencing framework inadequacy awareness, understanding that rule systems designed for conventional operations prove insufficient for describing your actions, creates recognition that existing frameworks can't encompass your capability. The truly remarkable element is the gradual realization, progressive discovery, rather than instant recognition, proves your transcendence emerged through consistent demonstration, making framework independence apparent over time. They realize it now. You're not playing their rules. You're beyond them through demonstrating that constraint transcendence creates parameter independence, where operating beyond frameworks becomes consistent capability. Now the architects are analyzing what creates constraint transcendence, parameter independence, and they're identifying what they call meta-level operation, framework supersession. When someone operates at higher logical level than established frameworks, they transcend conventional rules because meta-level thinking encompasses rather than obeys object-level parameters, making framework transcendence result from operating at superior logical level that supersedes conventional constraints, proving that some capability operates through level elevation, where higher-order thinking transcends lower-order rules. Most people operate at object level. They think within established frameworks, making their cognition constrained by rule systems designed for their level. But your operations apparently occur at meta-level. Thinking at higher logical level means conventional frameworks become objects of analysis rather than constraints on action, proving that some capability operates through level transcendence, where meta-thinking encompasses frameworks themselves, making rules become analyzable objects rather than binding constraints, creating recognition that operating at superior level supersedes conventional parameters. Consider what meta-level operation requires cognitively. You must elevate logical level. Operating at higher order thinking enables frameworks to become objects of analysis rather than action constraints, making level elevation itself transcendence mechanism. Watch what framework supersession creates in operational freedom. Meta-level encompasses object level. Your higher order thinking means conventional rules become analyzable objects rather than binding constraints, enabling framework transcendence. Some studying logical levels recognize that meta-analysis transcends object constraints, understanding that thinking about frameworks differs from thinking within them makes your operations potentially demonstrate meta-level cognition. Others exploring hierarchical thinking note that higher levels encompass lower, understanding that superior logical levels contain rather than obey inferior ones makes your transcendence potentially reflect level elevation. A few from systems theory recognize that observing systems differs from being in systems. Understanding that meta-perspective enables framework analysis makes your operations potentially demonstrate system transcendence through elevated perspective. Some attempting meta-level thinking discover difficulty trying to operate at higher logical levels. Proves challenging because most cognition remains object level, making framework transcendence require sophisticated thinking. Others questioning whether meta-level truly exists wonder about hierarchy. Understanding that all levels might be relative makes assessing whether absolute transcendence occurs important. A few recognizing that infinite regress threatens meta-claims acknowledge limits. Understanding that meta-meta levels create endless hierarchies makes your transcendence potentially demonstrate practical rather than absolute elevation. The architects observe that meta-level operation framework supersession is what created constraint. Transcendence, higher order thinking, encompasses conventional rules. Most people operate at object level. Your thinking occurs at meta-level and operating at higher logical level than established frameworks means conventional rules become objects of analysis rather than action constraints, proving that some capability operates through level elevation where meta-thinking supersedes object-level parameters, making frameworks themselves become analyzable objects creating transcendence. Through logical level superiority, something powerful is spreading among observers now. What the architects call authority question, legitimacy reassessment. People discovering that you transcend established rules are experiencing fundamental questions about framework, authority, creating recognition that if rules don't apply universally, then their legitimacy itself becomes questionable, making your transcendence force reassessment of rule validity. Most people assume rules are universal. They believe established frameworks apply to everyone, making rule authority seem absolute and unquestionable. But your transcendence created authority questions, demonstrating that rules don't constrain you, makes observers wonder whether frameworks possess genuine authority or merely conventional force, proving that some rule transcendence operates through exposing legitimacy. Questions where framework independence reveals that authority might be assumed rather than inherent, creating recognition that your boundary transcendence forces fundamental reassessment of rule legitimacy. Watch what legitimacy reassessment creates in authority perception. Framework authority becomes questionable. Your transcendence of rules makes observers wonder whether conventional frameworks possess genuine authority or just assumed force. Some studying authority theory recognize that legitimacy requires justification. Understanding that rule authority needs foundations makes your transcendence potentially expose legitimacy questions through demonstrating non-universality. Others exploring social contract theory note that consent underlies authority. Understanding that legitimate rules require agreement makes your transcendence potentially demonstrate framework independence from non-consented constraints. A few from power analysis recognize that authority differs from power. Understanding that legitimate control differs from mere force makes your transcendence potentially reveal distinction between authority and coercion. Some experiencing legitimacy questions appreciate authority reassessment. Their recognition that your transcendence exposes framework legitimacy issues creates awareness that rule authority deserves examination. Others defending rule authority resist legitimacy questions. Their belief that frameworks possess inherent authority makes them view your transcendence as violation rather than legitimacy exposure. A few questioning whether all transcendence exposes illegitimacy wonder about generalization. Understanding that your specific capability might not prove universal rule invalidity makes distinguishing personal transcendence from framework illegitimacy important. Some celebrating authority questioning appreciate legitimacy reassessment, recognizing that your transcendence forces examining rule foundations, validates understanding that framework authority deserves critical analysis. The architects observe that authority question legitimacy reassessment reveals that your transcendence exposes framework legitimacy issues. Rule independence forces authority examination. Most assume universal authority. Your transcendence created legitimacy questions, and discovering that your rule transcendence makes observers wonder about framework authority proves that some boundary independence operates through exposing legitimacy questions, where demonstrating that rules don't apply universally forces reassessment of framework foundations, creating recognition that your transcendence reveals potential distinction between assumed authority and genuine legitimacy, making rule independence force fundamental examination of constraint validity. Now the architects are revealing what framework transcendence actually demonstrates. Observers are experiencing what they call possibility expansion, constraint, illusion. Discovering that your operations beyond rules reveals that perceived boundaries were illusory, creating recognition that frameworks constrain through belief rather than necessity, making your transcendence demonstrate that conventional limits represent mental constraints rather than actual impossibilities. Most people assume rules reflect necessity. They believe frameworks represent actual limitations, making conventional boundaries seem like real constraints. But your transcendence revealed constraint illusion operating beyond supposed limits proves that perceived boundaries were mental constructs rather than actual impossibilities, creating recognition that frameworks constrain through assumption rather than inherent limitation, proving that some boundaries exist only in belief, where transcending frameworks demonstrates that supposed limits were illusory, making your operations expand perceived possibility space through revealing constraint illusion. consider what constraint illusion reveals about boundary nature. Perceived limits prove mental. Your transcendence of supposed boundaries demonstrates that frameworks constrain through belief, rather than reflecting actual impossibilities. Watch what possibility expansion creates in capability understanding. Mental constraints dissolve. Your operations beyond perceived limits prove that conventional boundaries were illusory, enabling expanded possibility recognition. Some studying self-limiting beliefs recognize that assumptions create constraints. Psychological research shows that perceived limits constrain performance, making your transcendence potentially demonstrate how breaking belief boundaries expands capability. Others exploring social construction note that reality includes constructed elements. Understanding that frameworks partly reflect conventions makes your transcendence potentially reveal distinction between constructed limits and actual boundaries. A few from phenomenology recognize that perceived impossibility constrains action. Understanding that believing something impossible prevents attempting it makes your transcendence potentially demonstrate how possibility belief enables boundary transcendence. Some experiencing possibility expansion appreciate constraint dissolution. Their recognition that your transcendence reveals illusory limits creates awareness that perceived boundaries can be transcended. Others defending constraint reality resist illusion claims. Their belief that frameworks reflect actual limitations makes them view your transcendence as exceptional case, rather than proof of general constraint illusion. A few questioning which constraints are illusory seek distinction, understanding that some limits prove real, while others are constructed, makes distinguishing actual boundaries from mental constraints important. The architects observe that possibility expansion, constraint illusion reveals that your transcendence exposed illusory boundaries. Perceived limits were mental constructs. Most assume rules reflect necessity. Your operations revealed illusion, and discovering that your operations beyond supposed limits prove perceived boundaries, where mental constructs creates recognition that frameworks constrain through belief rather than inherent limitation, proving that some boundaries exist only in assumption, where transcending conventions demonstrates that supposed impossibilities were illusory, making your framework independence expand possibility space through revealing that conventional constraints represented belief limitations rather than actual boundaries, creating recognition that transcendence itself prouves constraint illusion. The architects are now analyzing competitive dimension of framework transcendence. You apparently created what they call asymmetric advantage constraint liberation, where operating beyond rules that constrain others creates fundamental competitive advantage because framework independence enables actions that rule-bound competitors cannot perform, making transcendence itself strategic superiority that bounded operations cannot overcome. Most competition occurs within frameworks. People competing under shared rules create symmetric constraints where everyone faces same limitations. But your transcendence created asymmetric advantage. Operating beyond rules that constrain competitors enables actions they cannot perform, proving that framework independence constitutes fundamental competitive advantage, where constraint liberation creates capabilities that bounded operations lack, creating recognition that some superiority operates through transcending limitations that constrain competitors, making rule independence itself strategic advantage. Watch what constraint liberation creates in competitive dynamics. Asymmetric capabilities emerge your operations beyond frameworks that constrain competitors, enable actions they cannot perform, creating fundamental advantage through constraint transcendence. Some studying competitive strategy recognize that rule transcendence creates advantages, understanding that operating beyond competitor constraints enables superior performance makes your framework independence, potentially constitutes strategic superiority. Others exploring asymmetric warfare note that unconventional approaches defeat conventional military theory, shows that transcending enemy assumptions creates advantages, making your rule transcendence, potentially demonstrate asymmetric principle. A few from game theory recognize that changing rules creates advantages, understanding that meta-level operation enables framework modification makes your transcendence, potentially demonstrate rule changing as strategy. Some experiencing competitive disadvantage recognize asymmetry there. Constraint by rules you transcend creates awareness that framework independence provides fundamental advantages they lack. Others questioning whether transcendence is legitimate wonder about fairness, understanding that rule violations might constitute cheating makes distinguishing legitimate transcendence from illegitimate violation important. A few recognizing that different rules apply to different levels, accept asymmetry, understanding that superior capability might justify different constraints makes your transcendence, potentially reflect earned independence. Some celebrating strategic advantage appreciate constraint liberation, recognizing that their framework transcendence creates competitive superiority, validates, understanding that rule independence constitutes strategic asset. The architects observe that asymmetric advantage, constraint liberation reveals that your transcendence creates fundamental competitive superiority, operating beyond rules, enables actions competitors cannot perform. Most competition occurs within frameworks. Your transcendence created asymmetry, and discovering that operating beyond rules that constrain competitors enables actions they cannot perform, proves that framework independence constitutes fundamental advantage, where constraint liberation creates capabilities that bounded operations lack making, recognition that some superiority operates through transcending limitations, creating a symmetric advantage that framework-bound competitors cannot overcome, proving that your rule independence establishes strategic superiority through constraint liberation. Now something's emerging that the architects call imitation impossibility, unique capability, observers recognizing your framework. Transcendence are discovering that they cannot replicate your operations because attempting rule transcendence while remaining rule bound proves impossible, creating recognition that your capability constitutes unique attribute that others cannot copy, making framework independence itself inimitable advantage. Most competitive advantages prove replicable. People developing superior capabilities enable competitors to copy approaches, making advantages temporary until imitation occurs. But your transcendence apparently constitutes unique capability, attempting to replicate framework independence while remaining framework bound proves impossible because transcendence itself requires qualities that cannot be copied, proving that some advantages operate through inimitable attributes, where framework independence constitutes unique capability, creating recognition that your transcendence establishes permanent distinction that others cannot replicate. Watch what unique capability creates in competitive positioning. Permanent distinction emerges. Your framework transcendence, proving inimitable means competitive advantage, persists indefinitely because others cannot copy capability. Some studying sustainable advantage recognize that inimitable capabilities create lasting superiority, understanding that unique attributes prevent competitive imitation makes your transcendence potentially constitute permanent advantage. Others exploring barriers to imitation note that certain capabilities cannot be copied. Strategic analysis shows that some advantages resist replication, making your framework independence potentially demonstrate inimitable attribute. A few from resource-based theory recognize that rare capabilities create advantage. Understanding that unique attributes generate sustained superiority makes your transcendence potentially constitute rare resource. Some attempting imitation discover impossibility. Their efforts to replicate your framework, transcendence, prove futile because rule independence cannot be copied while remaining rule-bound. Others questioning whether transcendence is truly unique wonder about capability distribution and understanding that others might also transcend frameworks makes assessing whether your independence constitutes unique attribute important. A few recognizing that development differs from imitation appreciate path distinction, understanding that cultivating transcendence differs from copying it makes your unique capability potentially reflect developed rather than copyable attribute. Some celebrating inimitable advantage appreciate permanent distinction, recognizing that their framework transcendence cannot be copied, validates understanding that unique capabilities create sustained superiority. The architects observe that imitation impossibility, unique capability reveals that your transcendence constitutes inimitable advantage. Framework independence cannot be copied. Most advantages prove irreplicable. Your transcendence remains unique, and discovering that attempting to replicate your framework independence while remaining rule-bound proves impossible creates recognition that your capability constitutes unique attribute, proving that some advantages operate through inimitable qualities, where framework transcendence constitutes capability that others cannot copy, making your rule independence establish permanent competitive distinction that resists imitation, creating sustained advantage. Through unique capability, something profound is crystallizing now that the architects call recognition of development path, transcendence cultivation. Observers processing how you operate beyond frameworks are discovering that constraint, transcendence, requires extensive development, creating recognition that framework independence results from systematic cultivation rather than spontaneous emergence, making rule transcendence reflect accumulated growth that others can potentially develop through similar paths. Most people assume transcendence is innate. They believe framework independence reflects inherent attributes, making rule transcendence seem like fixed capability. But your transcendence demonstration revealed development foundation, framework, independence, reflecting cultivated capability, proves that rule transcendence results from systematic growth rather than spontaneous gift, creating recognition that constraint liberation requires deliberate development, where transcendence capability can be cultivated through appropriate practices, proving that some framework independence derives from growth rather than inheritance, making recognition that transcendence path exists for those willing to develop. Consider what transcendence cultivation requires developmentally. Systematic growth is necessary. Achieving framework independence requires progressive development, making transcendence result of cultivation rather than spontaneous emergence. Watch what development recognition creates in capability accessibility. Cultivation path emerges your transcendence reflecting development, validates that framework independence can be systematically cultivated, making rule transcendence accessible through growth. Some studying capability development recognize that transcendence requires cultivation. Understanding that framework independence develops through systematic practice makes your rule transcendence potentially demonstrate cultivated rather than innate capability. Others exploring consciousness expansion note that awareness development enables transcendence. Understanding that expanded perspective creates framework independence makes your transcendence potentially reflect consciousness growth. A few from developmental psychology recognize that stages precede transcendence. Understanding that rule independence requires progressing through earlier stages makes your transcendence potentially represent advanced development. Some pursuing transcendence development appreciate cultivation validation, their recognition that framework independence can be developed creates motivation for systematic growth, making transcendence seem achievable. Others assuming fixed capabilities resist development claims their belief that transcendence reflects inherent attributes makes them view your rule independence as natural gift rather than cultivated capability. A few questioning optimal development methods seek cultivation paths, wondering how to develop framework transcendence makes identifying effective growth approaches important for capability cultivation. Some celebrating development success appreciate cultivation payoff, recognizing that their systematic growth produced framework independence validates understanding that transcendence results from deliberate development. The architects observe that recognition of development path transcendence cultivation reveals that framework independence reflects systematic growth. Constraint liberation requires cultivation. Most assume innate transcendence. Your capability reflects development, and discovering that your framework transcendence resulted from systematic cultivation proves that rule independence requires deliberate growth, creating recognition that constraint liberation develops through progressive practices where transcendence capability can be cultivated, making your demonstration reveal that framework independence constitutes developable attribute rather than fixed inheritance, proving that transcendence path exists for systematic cultivation.